What we're now beginning to understand is how we have to do the analysis of all these things in a holistic way, both from an environmental, societal and economic point of view. And this is a sort of list of things that we think, not a full list, to give you some sort of indications that we look at climate, we look at ozone, where it's relevant, what resources does it use, what are the costs, what are the prices, because if it's regulated they're not the same thing, what's the safety issue, what are the public service obligation issues to make sure that society stays around this agenda in a sensible way. Can we get public participation in evaluating how useful a phenomena in infrastructure investment actually is? How does it serve the community rather than the individual? Land use, livability, which is in there as well. Noise, which we've sort of forgotten about, but it's actually very important, particularly as the urban dweller. And clean air. Clean air has been dominated in the UK by carbon dioxide emissions, and I've actually been fighting a bit of a battle to keep the clean air agenda on the map, because a lot of people have forgotten about it. It is a here and now problem for a lot of us, because we're changing a lot of the way we deliver efficiency in vehicles in particular. We have new pollutants. We don't have real-time mechanisms for examining those pollutants in city streets. In fact, I've just sponsored a piece of research that has done just that, and that is now public domain material. I've mentioned it already to colleagues here on my trip round. And then what does it do to the habitats, to the natural ecosystem on which we depend through national parks and farmland and other and beaches? So all of that is the sort of list of things we are now examining as a list of things that any infrastructural program of any type has to examine its conditioning with respect to. We also have to understand, at least for the UK, where's the money going to come from? 65% private money, another very small percentage now in public-private partnerships, and public around that number. That modulates the attitudes of people's, both business and governments, thoughts about how they should invest. I also discovered in going along this journey where other countries, including Australia, as you can see, in setting up Infrastructure Australia, have gone in thinking about how to manage national infrastructure at a national level. And of course the politics of those countries affects very significantly how they are going about doing it. I'm going to Singapore on the way back through to the UK on Monday, and Singapore has a certain way of going about doing things, as does Hong Kong. But the United States and France are in slightly different places, so is Canada, and it's quite interesting to see how the differences of the political systems, the history, the age of the country, the amount of original infrastructure versus new infrastructure modulates their thinking in how to manage their own futures. So as you start building the international framework around smart, taking account of those different factors, sociological, political, historical, I think are really quite important to understand what works for you and what you can grab from others, and what you can offer others. But it is certainly true, and this is US numbers, showing the decline in the federal and state and local investment over, in this case, 4 decades, nearly 5 decades, sorry, of the percentage of GDP that has been put into infrastructure investment. Now, these gross numbers give you a really good feel for how much is really going in and how much isn't. And if you said, well, what's the asset value of your infrastructure as a nation? And then said, and if I was a company that owned that sort of asset value, how much would I put in to keep that asset sustainable and fit for purpose? You'll find most developed countries don't put anything like that amount of money, let alone that amount of political and governance capital, into making sure that's the case. So what have we done about it? The UK government programme really started off in an integrated way across the government landscape when the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology published a report in June 2009 called An Infrastructure Fit for the 21st Century. I had the privilege of being part of the team that created that report. It's online, you can read it. And that triggered the then Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, into making a recommendation that was accepted in government in December, in that year, the end of the year, to form up, it was accepted in December 2009 by the Brown government. And that formed up a body called Infrastructure UK in the Treasury. Now, Infrastructure UK survived the election in May 2010. And it goes back to the point that Nick made, that political continuity is really important. A lot of initiatives like this I'm afraid, sort of fall off the edge when you go through an election. And this one didn't. We were really rather pleased. So by December 2010, the first National Infrastructure Plan was launched by our Prime Minister, David Cameron, in the House. And that again is a document on the HM Treasury website that you can now pull off and read. What I have the responsibility for within that programme is to deliver the engineering interdependency and resilience programmes that will help us formulate what we call NIP2, the National Infrastructure Plan version 2, which will be published this autumn. There will be further findings to do with interdependency and resilience from case studies that we're now working on, work in progress, will be published in May, and obviously as soon as that's public domain I can share it. So it's to give you some idea of our timescale and what we're doing. And that will make, amongst a lot of other things, some recommendations for research across a whole range of activity. Now, our research landscape in our research councils, I'm now shifting right the way back to the front end of the intellectual input into this debate, has not only deep dive in discipline programs, it also has a significant amount of money put into what we call cross-research council money, cross-research council programs that are aimed at these big grand challenges: energy, digital economy, global food, global uncertainties, lifelong health and well-being, living with environmental change. Now those numbers are the numbers over the next 4 years from this April. And that is committed in the government spend. Now that's, if my arithmetic is right, that's about 1.8 billion over 4 years. It's about 450 million pounds a year across that lot, which in themselves are joined up. So we think we have a research program that is pretty joined up. The research that's needed across all those topics starts with systems thinking, not just systems engineering, thinking about the whole societal, economic, governance, political science, as well as engineering systems. And we have a number of universities that are working in that space. And one of the things they'll be examining is the interdependencies and aspects of that and getting more work done. We talked about data, that's the way I say it, observational data for smart infrastructure. And I'm going to make sure I'm a physicist originally, and we were taught very rigorously to understand the difference between observation and diagnostics. Observation is when you look at something with no idea how what you're looking at really works, in order that you get data about what is happening. So you can then draw up some hypothesis of how it might be working. Because if you do diagnostics, you've got a model in your head, and you'll only look at the things that are actually relevant to you. That may sound a bit philosophical, but actually I think one of the financial problems the world is now in is because people didn't understand how subprime mortgages and hedge funds fitted into the financial market, so they never looked at it. We now know they're very important players in the financial markets, and if we'd been examining them, observing them a bit better, we might have not been in the mess we're in. And that brings me neatly to impact of regulation, including how risk management is looked after, because regulators are there to look after some element of risks, but typically market risks. Actually, we need to look after a whole bunch of different risks, and if regulators don't, who does, is another issue that we need to do some social and governance research on. Importantly, and one of the really good topics Gary and I have been talking about this week, is how do you develop international benchmarks and exchange of ideas and approaches. I'm very keen that we continue a dialogue, if not more, a deeper discourse with you in Australia to see how we can take that forward. And not least, have we got enough educated people who even can approach this subject in a sensible way? So there's a big teaching agenda